Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and we're going to talk about the invitation to Dungeon Master. Very interesting topic. Alright, so I did an entire series. It's called the Dungeon Master Bullet Point series, and the whole point of it was to say when you should be incredibly careful about inviting anyone to Dungeon Master. And the reason why is the call to Dungeon Master is essentially, in my humble opinion, a dangerous path, right? I think a lot of people think that if you try to Dungeon Master, everything's going to work out honky-dory. It's a simple thing, and you're going to be great at it. And I'm convinced that is not the case. I think the call to Dungeon Master takes a lifetime to master. You will have suffering in the path to being a Dungeon Master. It is not the title of a Dungeon Gooder. It is calling you to master calling you to master minimum 10 disciplines, which are covered in my bullet point series. And I think the reality is a large number, I would actually say 51% or more, fail to ever be a dungeon master. They end up being a dungeon gooder or a dungeon batter. Like they run, they try to be a dungeon master. They never reach the point of mastery in the game. Also, in case you're paying attention, the Dungeon magazine that was printed while Gary Gygax was at TSR, the title on the cover said Mastering the Game and Beyond. So there's even the idea that the concept of dungeon mastering requires mastery beyond simply the idea of mastery beyond simple the rules of the game, but mastery of life. And that, it's incredibly deep and very powerful call, right? So with that said, I've said, hey, you should be incredibly hesitant to actually invite someone to be a dungeon master because you don't really understand what you're calling them to. You're calling them to warp their emotional and their intellectual state and make themselves do a lot more reading than they would have ever done, be interested in topics they would never have been interested in. They have to essentially understand humanity at a cultural level, at a personal level. They have to have more understanding of themselves. It's just such a gigantic calling, right? So a ton of people will disagree with me on this, and they'll come at me in the comments, and they'll say, and so recently, there was a commenter who said something. I did learn from it. I don't think it was a lesson they were hoping to teach, but it was a fascinating comment, right? So what they said is, hey, Scott, I was watching your channel, and then as soon as I was done watching your channel, the autoplay served up Matthew Mercer talking at Google, right? And what if Matthew Mercer had listened? What if the person that invited Matthew Mercer to be a Dungeon Master, if Matthew Mercer had been hesitant and been seen, I don't know if I should do that, right? Because what if I failed, right? What if I discover I'm never going to be a dungeon master. I'll always just be a dungeon batter, a dungeon gooder. I'm not capable of dungeon mastering, right? And there's a loss. There's like a personal loss there if you discover you can't dungeon master. Well, I've seen it. I've seen people get there. It can be incredibly frustrating for them, right? And so he said, what if Matthew Mercer had listened to your advice and had been hesitant to be a dungeon master, right? I thought about it. One, thank you very much for the person who gave me that comment. It was a great comment because it did make me think. And then I was like, you know what? I know where this lands. Ain't nobody ever invited Matthew Mercer to Dungeon Master. Right? Now, I'll tell you right now, I was not invited by anyone to Dungeon Master. Right? So I discovered the game when I was about 10 years old. I was in Racine, Wisconsin. And I came across a kid who was like, I own a castle. And I was like, what are you talking about? You don't own a castle. Like, you own a big wheel. Right? Like, and I own a green machine. Right? And so we're having this discussion, and and he gets into his older brother played Dungeons & Dragons, and he explained what it was. It would be 2 years before I get my hands on the red box in 1982, and it would completely transform my life, right? So, and I had to go through this path to get the game from my parents because I couldn't buy it myself, right? And I wasn't. Yeah, that's just the way the world worked then. In my circle of the world, I just didn't have that kind of money. I didn't have access to go to a store, so I had to get it through my parents, right? And so basically, but no one ever asked me to be a dungeon master. I didn't even play Dungeons and Dragons. It was like, I need to be a dungeon master immediately, right? Like, I was drawn to it like a moth to the flame. So here's my new revelation, right? I don't think anyone should ever ask anyone to be a dungeon master or invite them to dungeon mastering. Here's why. I love the book Fight Club. I read it before I saw the film, and then I saw the film, and the film was absolutely fantastic as well. So in the film, Fight Club, Tyler Durden has an organization, and there are young men who come to, actually young and old men. There's like a whole bunch of men who say, hey, I know Tyler Durden. I've heard about Tyler Durden. He has this little Fight Club. And you know what? I want to do more than Fight Club. I want to help Tyler Durden accomplish his goals, right? And so these young men would go to Tyler Durden's house to join the group that helped Tyler Durden achieve his goals, right? And so what would happen is they would go to the house and they would say, hey, I'm here to join Tyler Durden's group. I want to help Tyler Durden achieve his goals. And so one of Tyler Durden's allies, right, who lived with him, would meet that person at the door and they would say, go kick rocks. You're not welcome here. We don't want you. Go, leave, right? And then that person would either leave or they would say, no, I'm not leaving. I'm going to stay right here on this porch, right? And the next day, Tyler Durden's ally would come out and say, what are you still doing here, you terrible person? You don't belong here. You're not good enough to help Tyler Durden achieve his goals. You're not welcome here. Go kick rocks. Beat it, right? And the person would either leave because they've been buffeted away, or they would stay, right? And when they would stay, they would get to the third day, right? And, you know, they would just sit on the porch, sleeping outside on the porch, right? And on the third day, Tyler Durden's ally would come out and would say, what are you doing here? And the person would say, I'm here to help Tyler Durden, achieve his goals. I want to be part of the group that helps Tyler Durden achieve his goals. And they're like, get your butt inside. You're part of the group. You're in, right? And I think that's the right model for dungeon mastering, right? Like, it is not something to call people to lightly. You will suffer as a dungeon master. You will offend players. You will waste people's time. You will be embarrassed by your choices, right? You will look, after 5 years of dungeon mastering, you will look back at what you did in your first 6 months and say, how could I have subjected those players to that awful style of play, right? You will, if you commit yourself to dungeon mastering and you dungeon master at length and do not stop, you will suffer. You will have suffering that will come into your life because you chose to be a dungeon master. And I think it's wrong for us to continue to pretend this isn't the truth, to pretend that Dungeons & Dragons is even remotely intuitive, remotely simple, and that the word master is not attached to it. It's not something to take lightly. It requires the mastering of 10 plus disciplines, right? And honestly, I think we should hold it at arm's length. I don't think we should ever invite anyone to dungeon mastering, because the best dungeon masters in the world were never invited. They stayed on the porch for 3 days, right? And they go to dungeon mastering because they are drawn to it like a moth to a flame. And not only do they not need to be invited to dungeon master, they cannot be stopped from dungeon mastering. It is in their blood and courses through them like the lava blood of a red dragon, right? They don't need to be invited. They cannot be stopped. I am of the new opinion that no one should ever invite anyone to dungeon master. If you would like, you can invite someone to play in a Dungeons & Dragons game, knowing that the path may lead to dungeon mastering. And when we never invite anyone to dungeon master, when we never ask anyone to dungeon master, the only people who will pick up the DMG are the people who are fully capable, fully willing, right? And if they find that there's ever, and I don't think, and the willing part I think will be guaranteed there, and the capability part will be tooth and claw. It will be there in the beginning because that person had courage in their heart immediately, or that person will tooth and claw their way to the capability they need, right? Which is intelligence, charisma, and confidence. Those are the elements that are poured together to make the greatest dungeon masters in the world. New Scott Garibay opinion: no one should ever invite someone to dungeon master. No one should ever ask anyone to dungeon master. It is a calling that is too high, and those who belong to it will be drawn to it. There will be no invitation needed. You will not be able to keep them from the DMG. The greatest dungeon masters in the world choose the path on their own. They never leave the porch, and they make sure they take it. It's never offered. That's my opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.